The following Pharma Essentia podcast is intended for informational and educational purposes only and cannot be considered as medical advice. Please speak to a healthcare professional before making any treatment decisions. Gay Vermeil.
Josh Bragg.
Great things come in 12s.
Months in a year.
Inches in a foot.
Eggs in a carton.
Disciples in a flock.
And donuts in a box.
Especially donuts in a box.
Just like so many of these great things before us, Season 1 of the PV Pod comes in a tiny little dozen.
Okay, isn't this episode 12?
It sure is.
So that means...
This is the last episode of Season 1 of the PV Pod, Stories from the Marrow.
A podcast about polycythemia vera.
Brought to you by Pharma Essentia.
Thanks, Pharma Essentia. All right, so our last episode was a really phenomenal recap of the season.
Right. We met all of our guests again. We went over relevant terms. We ran through important topics.
Symptoms, treatment, community support.
It's a fun episode. Go back and listen if you haven't had a chance.
But that sort of makes me wonder, what's left to cover in our final episode of season 1?
I'm a pilot. I had to stop flying as a pilot in command because of the symptoms. Actually, there's nothing legally grounding me by the FAA with polycythemia vera. But the symptoms, which cause the brain fog and memory and lack of coordination, have caused me to personally ground myself.
Cabin crew, prepare for landing, thank you.
Josh, I'd like to introduce you to Ken Stein.
I live in Merritt Island, Florida, which is also the home of the Kennedy Space Center, by the way, so my house shakes occasionally. I'm 77 years old. I was diagnosed with polycythemia vera just about 4 years ago.
So Ken is a pilot, or was a pilot.
I can still fly. I can still manipulate the controls and stuff. I could fly with an instructor, but I can't fly anymore as a pilot in command.
Wow. So Ken has determined he can't work as a pilot anymore because of the symptoms of his PV. That's something I hadn't thought about. How the symptoms of PV can impact your ability to do your job. It also makes me think about how some people say PV is the good cancer. It's already a dismissive idea, but polycythemia vera literally pulled Ken out of the sky.
People call it the good cancer, and I even refer to it that way sometimes because there's no surgery, there's no radiation, I should say, there's no surgery, and all of the things that you see with cancers that debilitate people and cause them to look different, if you will. I look the same. I can't say I lost my hair because I didn't have any to start with, but I think it's good in that way. But on the other hand, it really minimizes the fact that while I may look without having those debilitating things of other cancer treatments, I still have debilitating symptoms.
In our final episode of the PV Pod Season 1, we're going to be hearing from Ken about his diagnosis story and living with PV. More from Ken right after this quick break.
So you're learning about PV on the PV Pod, Stories from the Marrow. Now get ready to take the next steps on your PV journey with What's Next PV, an educational site on everything polycythemia vera.
Knowing what's next can help inform the decisions you and your doctor make about the future and is important to your health. What's Next PV can help you understand test results, set goals for the management of your PV, and make a plan to advocate for yourself. Check out www.whatsnextpv.com to learn more.
And we're back.
Thanks for sticking around.
Okay, I'm really glad we're wrapping up our first season with a patient story.
Me too, but why are you glad?
Getting to tell patient stories is one of my favorite parts of my job. They're all so unique. We could do 100 episodes about people living with PV, and none of them would be the same. There would be similarities, of course, but everyone's experience is completely different. And when you give these stories a platform, other people living with PV have a chance to hear them and maybe feel less alone.
Especially in rare diseases, when you might not know anyone else who's diagnosed with what you have.
That's a great point. Has Ken met anybody else living with PV?
No, I have not. I say that personally. In 22, I was invited to join a panel in Chicago to discuss PV, and they brought PV patients in from around the country, and there were 12 of us there. So I met 12 people with PV. Beyond that, I don't know anybody with PV. I don't know anybody who knows anybody with PV.
Well, I'm glad he got to be on that panel and got to meet other people living with PV.
This actually ties in really well with the special event I wanted to plug.
Ooh, a special event?
Yep, on Saturday, April 5th, Pharma Essentia is hosting PV in Focus.
Well, tell me more.
It's located in Boston, Massachusetts, and it's an in-person day of community and education. There'll be presentations featuring keynote speakers who will discuss an overview of PV, treatment options, patient perspectives, self-advocacy, and mental health.
That sounds amazing. Who's this event for? Like, who should consider signing up for this?
Patients and caregivers of those living with PV are encouraged to attend.
Great. Now, if I were a patient or caregiver, where would I sign up?
You can register by visiting pvinfocus.com. If you are not local to Boston but interested in learning more, visit the website to stay up to date on future PV in Focus events that will take place throughout the country.
Amazing. This all makes me think of previous episodes when other patients have stressed how important it is to build community. So, does Ken have that community? And if so, how did he get it?
I am on a couple of Facebook pages, Facebook support groups on Facebook.
So Ken is something of a Facebook aficionado.
That is right, and it's a great reminder that community support can be all shapes and sizes. In fact, these support groups have been so important to Ken that it's his first piece of advice for anyone who's been recently diagnosed with PV.
I think that the first thing that I would recommend they do is to find a support group that is focused on polycythemia vera. It is so unique in its way and so rare that the normal support groups are nice, but they don't have the information or experience that can help. But I found one on Facebook, PV support group, and when I was new, they went in there and I talked to them, said I'm a new guy, and they said, okay, here's where you go to find a list of questions you should ask your doctor. What questions do you have? Here are articles that you can read. Here's website and YouTube videos. Find a group that supports PV and tell them you're new and listen to what they have to say.
I love that. And it just goes to show how important patient leaders are, like David Wallace and how he runs the PV Reporter.
Exactly. But before we get too far, I'd like to go back to Ken's diagnosis story.
Initially, my primary care physician just said that he had some questions about my blood work and sent me to see a specialist, which I didn't pay much attention to until I turned into the parking lot and saw on the side of the building the Health First Cancer Center. Was sort of the first indication. It didn't say general medicine or anything else, just cancer here, that's all.
So Ken deduced he was getting blood work done to see if he had cancer from the side of the building.
That is correct.
Oh my gosh, that's got to be so overwhelming.
Well, it was kind of shocking. And the same goes with going in and saying, okay, they did a blood test, and they said, all right, well, now wait 6 months and we'll tell you if you have cancer or not. And that, that's a long 6 months.
I'm sorry, wait, what? He had to wait 6 months to get his diagnosis?
So when I went in and saw the oncologist, hematologist, then he told me, well, we're going to take a look at your blood work and come back in 6 months, and we'll see if there's been any change. So I had a 6-month time frame in which to wait to see if there was a change in my blood work.
He said it again, but I still can barely wrap my mind around that. I can't imagine having to wait 6 months to find out if I had cancer or not.
Finally, when I had the second blood work done, they came in and said that they had determined I had polycythemia vera, and they characterized it as a blood cancer. So that was my introduction to it. Took a little while, a little time frame to think about it, but that was my introduction.
Yeah, so Ken's introduction to PV was a bit different than those we've heard in the past.
See, this is why I love patient stories. They're so incredibly unique, and other patients have probably had similar experiences to Ken. It's always nice to know you aren't alone.
Agreed.
So what's it been like for Ken living with PV now? We heard earlier that he had to stop being a pilot because of the symptoms being disorienting. What else has he experienced?
Well, for me, living with PV on a day-to-day basis is really a day-to-day basis. I have good days, I have mediocre days, I have bad days.
This reminds me of what Nick Napolitano said in our earlier episodes about how living with PV is a journey.
Right, like a full season of baseball.
And it's not, sometimes it can be associated with my symptom load, can be associated with the need of a phlebotomy perhaps, but generally speaking, for no known reason that I can identify, sleep, diet, whatever I'm doing, stress, that it increases or decreases the load. So each day, if you will, can be a new adventure in living with PV. And I don't think people understand the symptoms that I have. I am very thankful, if you will, that I'm retired. I am on a couple of Facebook pages that support PV with other PV people. And the folks that have to go to work, have to get up regardless of the type of day they have. I really have empathy for them. But no, I don't think others understand why we can be one way one day and one way the next day and not look any different. We're not running a fever, we're not flushed, we're not coughing, we're just not there. And that's hard for people to understand. Especially when you say cancer, because with cancer, they're used to seeing people with debilitating things. Hair loss, loss of weight, weakness, going through these radical treatments that we, with the good cancer, don't have to go through.
There's that phrase that we try to avoid, the good cancer.
There's also the other thing that patients are commonly told, that they'll die with PV, not from it.
I think that's a standard mantra from the doctors who diagnose you with PV and within people within the PV community. And again, as with the good cancer, I think it minimizes it because it says you'll die with PV, not from it. It makes it sound like you're just living with it. You know, it's sort of like high blood pressure. You live with high blood pressure, you take a pill, and your blood pressure is under control for most people. That's not really the case with PV for many of us, and that it's not something that's going to strike me down tomorrow. I didn't get told I have a cancer that's going to, stage 4 cancer that's going to do me in 3 months. But at the same time, living with it does change your life. And so it's not, I think that minimizes it, and I would not characterize it as gently as that makes it sound.
Seems like we can't say that enough. People with PV might not look like what you imagine someone with cancer to look like, but like Ken said, they do have cancer. The symptoms can be debilitating. You have to change your life. No one should try to minimize that experience.
Exactly. We asked Ken what some of the challenges are when it comes to living with PV.
Well, the biggest challenge is a lack of understanding of people that I do have what can be a debilitating disease, that I do have a cancer, and I deserve credit for having my cancer. You know, they say, oh, you can't be sick. Well, I deserve credit for being sick. I am. I can show you the paperwork. So the challenge is I shouldn't say convincing, but having people understand that, yes, this is not a good day for me and I don't look any different than I did yesterday. Another challenge I have, because my wife and I travel extensively internationally, when I leave the country, I'm on a 9-week cycle now for blood tests to determine whether I need a phlebotomy or not. And when I travel internationally, I have to make arrangements in advance for the blood tests and if I need a phlebotomy, if I can get that done. So traveling for some people, of course, other diseases have that, like if you need some other treatments, but that can be a trauma. And also out of the country, what we call a phlebotomy is actually called a dissection outside of the United States. And so terminology can sometimes be a challenging too when you're out of the country and trying to get treatment with blood tests and phlebotomies, as we call it.
I want to take it back for a moment and hear from Ken about how he broke the news to his family. He mentions here that the lack of understanding is the biggest challenge that he faces. So how did he help his family understand all of this?
Well, I have adult children, and while PV is not hereditary, they have not established that link, they have found it is familial. Therefore, my children, they have an idea that they have this familial relationship. So when I talk to my family, being a little detail-oriented as I am, I put together a PowerPoint presentation. They don't live around me, and I got everybody on a webinar and went through this PowerPoint presentation because I had to give them the understanding that they needed to go talk to their PCP and get them watching their blood work in more detail. They're all in their mid-50s now, and they had to be watching their blood work most more detailed. So I told them about it. I did the you'll die with it, not from it. I think that's very soothing, if you will, to family members. We don't have to go into all the details I discussed like with you. And they have a full understanding of what it is, what they have to watch for, what their PCP has to watch for, and they are watching their stuff, hopefully. Now, on the other hand, my wife is different. She is very nervous about this, and I have a hard time talking about this sometimes. She's literally terrified, and it causes me some stress, as you can see, when I talk about it. So with her, I am a more direct and keep a much closer hold on what I tell her to avoid giving her a lot of stress, because it is a very long-term thing. You cannot overreact on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, love a PowerPoint. That would honestly be really, really helpful.
I also like that Ken is handling information according to stress level and to assist with stress management. As we've heard from previous guests on the show, managing stress levels is so important when living with PV.
What's it been like for Ken working with his healthcare team? I know a lot of our guests need to seek second opinions.
When I went to that cancer center, as I talked about, I went in and I was told what I had, and I did the research and realized what it was. And I went and found some polycythemia vera support groups on Facebook. There was a list of MPM specialists, and I found one at the Moffitt Cancer Center in Tampa, a couple-hour drive away from where I am, and went over to him for a second opinion. And it turns out he knows my local cancer doctor and has many patients referred to back and forth. So I did get a second opinion, and I have stayed with those two gentlemen for the course of my treatment.
Throughout the show, we've advocated for the right for you as a patient to seek a second opinion. Remember, you can build your healthcare team to make yourself as comfortable as possible. Also, your relationship with your healthcare professionals is ongoing.
And as I watch research, I watch the YouTube videos from the various conferences that people have, and occasionally read some of the latest research, which is hard to do, so I don't spend too much time reading as opposed to watching presentations at the symposiums. And my MPM specialist at Moffitt Cancer Center, he sometimes speaks at those, and I watch his presentations. And I challenge him sometimes, well, do you think I should be going on it? My numbers are pretty stable. Maybe it would help. And, we have that discussion. So I do bring it to them, new things that I hear, but I really bow to their judgment, if you will, in the long term.
I love how Ken is advocating for himself by staying up to date with current research and new advancements surrounding PV. This is such a good attitude to have.
I think I'm coming up time for another splenectomy to check the size of my spleen. I think it might be getting big based upon my loss of appetite and some fullness that I'm feeling that are indications of an enlarged spleen. And my local oncologist has not really been too accepting of that. So right now we're in discussion. He thinks a little early. I think, hey, I have insurance, so I may want to have it checked. So we're sort of dancing about that right now. We'll see how it comes out. But I have full confidence in them, and he is doing what he thinks is best for me, by his recommendation. But I am responsible for my treatment.
I really like that phrase, I am responsible for my treatment. It speaks to the need for self-advocacy while navigating your diagnosis.
And a little funny aside, if you will, my primary care physician knows I have PV, obviously, but I went to him already diagnosed. I saw him just yesterday, and he said in a joyous way, I have my first PV patient that I diagnosed. I think because he had me, he was aware of it and noticed it because he followed my blood work too. He's been a doctor for 30 years, and this is the first time. And he said that you came to me diagnosed, but I found one myself. And he sort of claimed it as a badge. I said, well, they should double your salary because you've doubled your PV patient load.
I mean, that really does just go to show that when you advocate for yourself as a patient, you're not just helping yourself, but you're raising awareness on a larger scale so that other people can get diagnosed as well, even if it's just with your primary care physician.
This has been a wonderful conversation. I'm so glad we could fit Ken into this season.
Me too. It has been a fantastic dozen.
Thanks, Ken, for sharing your story with us.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us on this season of the PV Pod. Don't forget to check out that event we mentioned earlier, PV in Focus.
This has been the first season of the PV Pod Stories from the Marrow,
a podcast about polycythemia vera.
So where's that dozen donuts?
The PV Pod Stories from the Marrow is produced by Believe Limited and Bloodstream Media, and made possible thanks to our sponsor, Pharma Essentia. The PV Pod is hosted by me, Kay Vermeil, and my co-host, Josh Bragg. If you like the show, please share it with anyone for whom it might make a difference, and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We'll see you next time.